In the history of the welterweight division, there really isn't anybody quite like Carlos Condit. As a fighter who's endured in perception for over a decade after his prime and is reminisced about in more glowing terms than maybe anybody who never became champion in his weight class, Carlos Condit's status as an MMA darling has always been his signature move in the history books. And when you see him fight, it's really easy to see why. Condit is aggressive, he's durable, he produces moment after moment, fight after fight, all the while fighting uphill against a division where he was never supposed to succeed. In the end, Condit retired without a UFC championship, and is typically regarded as someone who can be on the shortlist for best to never win the big one, which has always intrigued me. As someone who watched Condit, who was there for the bulk of his relevant career and have studied enough history to understand where he stands, I think that determining Condit's place in the history of the sport is absolutely worthwhile. Is he overrated because of his reputation, or is he truly the king that never got his crown? Take a walk with me as we ask, how good was Carlos Condit really? In the conversation about Carlos Condit, there are three distinct qualities to him that I think are worth talking about that contribute to his reputation as a beloved legend of the sport. Those being his status in the welterweight division in totality, his status as a regional welterweight hero, and finally, his lasting legacy as I see it. These are all pretty distinct stories that make up the grander novella of Condit's career, but at the end, we will bring them together and determine where Condit sits in history, both as a rankable fighter in a division and just as a character in the tapestry of MMA. Carlos Condit's reputation as the aggressive antithesis to the welterweight division was solidified long before he made it to the UFC. He's actually very interesting in that way. Condit was notably the WEC welterweight champion when it was purchased by the UFC. And while fighters like Brian Stann and Chael Sonnen were able to distinguish themselves with their own identities as UFC fighters, Condit's reputation from his WEC fights were so important to his identity that people will still reminisce about WEC Condit like he's Jose Aldo. Admittedly, Condit in the WEC is a very fun fighter who notably was very strong at fighting from guard. Something that was notable because, one, that's not a skill set that exists in real fights, and two, because even then, Carlos Condit was very famously wrestling averse, which, for a welterweight, is extremely weird. It's a subject that is talked about to death, but wrestling is the most important skill set in MMA because it ultimately decides where the fight takes place. If you're a striker, you're basically just waiting until you try to not get taken down, at which point the actual question of the fight happens. But while divisions like light heavyweight are much more notable for its top fighters being able to prevent takedowns, welterweight has always been disproportionately dominated by top position wrestlers. If you look at the dominant fighters in welterweight history, like Kamaru Usman, Matt Hughes, GSP, Tyron Woodley, you're going to see fighters who primarily use wrestling and control as their skill set. Underneath the top level, where you find the short-term champions or notably strong contenders throughout history, those are also going to be disproportionately wrestlers. Leon Edwards, Johnny Hendricks, John Fitch, Josh Koscheck, Jake Shields, Damian Maia, etc. Then you have the fighters who are not wrestlers who ascend to contender status, the beloved minority class of welterweight history. And the especially good ones, like Thiago Alves, BJ Penn, Rory McDonald, Stephen Thompson, are famously good at preventing wrestlers from imposing their game. And then you have Carlos Condit. Condit is a unicorn in the division's history, largely because he is successful while notably being bad at stopping wrestling. If we take a glance at UFC stats, a website I don't love, but it gives a pretty decent picture, reveals that Condit's takedown defense stats from his tracked fights rests at 38%. For reference, if we take a modern fighter like Khalil Roundtree, who is generally considered to be more wrestling averse than the average bear to the point where a Reddit thread was posted asking who would win, Prime Rashad Evans or Khalil Roundtree, with the general consensus saying Rashad simply takes him down. Roundtree's takedown defense stats rest at 58% on the same site. Again, I don't love these stats, it's just a general picture, but something that is more interesting that we can take from these stats is that of the fights that are recorded, every fight that Condit did not get taken down, no takedown was ever attempted. Meaning that if Carlos Condit ever escaped a fight without being taken down, he never had to defend one. Honestly, this makes him so fucking cool historically. A fighter who says, fuck your divisional meta, I'm just gonna slay ass, and then still wins is so metal. The way he did this also contributes to his historic favor from fans. In the WEC, he would get taken down, but using his very active guard, he would still threaten submissions or sweeps and persevere through positional pressure. But when he went to the UFC, where an actively threatening guard simply does not exist because we're not fucking 12 years old anymore, Condit's guard was still one of the greatest bear traps in the game. Anybody who took Condit down in the UFC, which, as mentioned, was almost literally everybody, they then had to contend with his defensive guard. Condit would trap wrists, actively disrupt the hips, threaten escapes and strikes from the bottom, basically making the job of the fighter on top dedicate 100% of his efforts to controlling Condit, unable to inflict any damage or pass to a better position, all while Condit was making them work to control him. What this materialized in was Condit's dominance as the fight went late against gassy wrestlers who spent all of their energy trying to keep him down, at which point the cardio-rich Condit was coming for that ass. There are a lot of fighters historically who have used cardio as a weapon in MMA. Maurice Smith in 1997, Pride Heath Herring, Nick Diaz famously pushed people until they were sucking wind trying to keep up and he just swallowed them. But Condit's reliability as a guard player who would come alive late cemented his status as someone who would always win the fight if it was 5 rounds. That you didn't beat Condit, you simply played the game and waited him out. This reputation was also one that belonged to the Diaz brothers at the time, more notably Nick Diaz, who was also wrestling averse, and people mostly beat him by shooting and holding him down while eating punches from the bottom. The old line being, you never beat Nick Diaz, he simply ran out of time. And it's something that I think feels so strong for Condit because it just feels so old school Gracie, right? The idea that if there were no time limits, just 2 men fighting forever, that Condit would just win every fight because he was so much better than them at everything besides playing the points and positional game. It's something that cemented Condit as a figure that people always rooted for in the early 2010s, as welterweight had long been dominated by lay and pray wrestlers up and down the roster. All of that said, Condit's success at welterweight despite his aversion to wrestling is, I think, a bit misremembered. Everything I've said so far is how Condit was perceived then and how he is perceived historically. But when you look at when he had the most success, being his 5-fight win streak between 2009 and 2012, the question has to be asked, where are the good wrestlers? Jake Ellenberger was his rebound fight after Martin Kampmann, and while he's a wrestler on paper, he was a regional fighter debuting against Condit, and in every fight after the Condit fight, he mostly doesn't wrestle as much as he was an insane power-punching athlete. Rory McDonald, again, regional guy, notably no wrestling background, and while he was solid on the ground in fights afterwards, I don't think I'd ever consider him a strong wrestler. Dan Hardy, famously, was navigated to a UFC title shot without ever facing a good fighter, let alone a good wrestler, and the bout was signed with the express intention to not have a welterweight fight dominated by wrestling. The best offensive wrestler that he faces is Dong Hyun Kim, a technically undefeated lay and pray judoka who was trying to break into the top echelon. But his best win was famously wrestling averse lightweight Nate Diaz. I don't think Condit was navigated away from wrestlers per se. This era mostly just saw the wrestling heavy top contenders like John Fitch and Josh Koscheck busy or injured when Condit was available. And while I could probably nag about mid-card fighters like Rick Story or 2010 Johnny Hendricks, or lament about how Condit could have easily been Jake Shields' debut opponent in 2010, I don't think this really matters all that much. This isn't to say that Carlos Condit is a fraud like Dan Hardy. Condit still faced good fighters unlike Hardy, but I think that a lot of Condit's reputation of able to win despite being wrestling averse mostly stems from like 2 or 3 fights, all of which he probably should have lost. After his flirtation with contendership in 2012 and 2013, Carlos Condit bounced back to go 2-1, beating a washed-up Kampmann and Alves and getting injured against Woodley before being gifted a title fight against Robbie Lawler. And I'm not going to get into the logistics of this fight and the scoring because ultimately I don't think it matters to Condit's overall place within the welterweight division in totality, but this is the part that generally sticks with people because it was the closest Condit came to a championship and he was wrestling averse. Therefore, he was a great fighter worthy of winning the championship despite his lack of wrestling. And at the time, I just never put him on that level. I think that his success given his terminal lack of wrestling is admirable, but I don't think that he was a championship caliber fighter because whenever he fought top class wrestlers, he was shown to be dreadfully lacking. It's easy to project his success in the third round against Hendricks, or hide behind an injury loss to Tyron Woodley to delegitimize these wins, but that's only if you're willing to disregard how the actual fights went in order to support your favorite guy. For all of his flaws as a championship-level fighter, Robbie Lawler did fight wrestlers and did better than Condit. His Hendricks fights were better. His Rory fights were better. Koscheck was washed up, but his only losses since 2009 were GSP and Johnny Hendricks. If we ask ourselves the question, how good was Carlos Condit really, and we omit his actual successes versus the field of wrestlers and how he is perceived to have succeeded versus the field of wrestlers, then ultimately we're doing a disservice to the analysis. While Condit's place as a welterweight is something that I think is more myth than reality, his reputation as a regional welterweight hero is warranted. Welterweight is such an interesting division because while I wouldn't consider it a historically deep division, the amount of regional heroes that it hosts is probably second to none. In the late 90s, you have Pat Miletich throttling anybody who stepped into Iowa before he wins the inaugural UFC championship in 1998. Late 90s, early 2000s, you have Matt Hughes carrying the mantle from Miletich, only he is able to get some actually good wins and is able to win in Japan. Nick Diaz leaves the UFC and settles in Elite XC and Strikeforce, which I wouldn't consider fully regional, but it's a major part of his reputation and aura. Robbie Lawler is a weird asterisk because he was a middleweight the whole time, but he's generally considered a welterweight, so I do count him. And then there's the god of regional welterweights. If there's a welterweight championship anywhere or a popping fighter at 170 in the 2000s and he didn't beat them, then it's news to me. That stupid dumb fucker, Jake Shields. It really is annoying how much you have to praise Jake Shields in this conversation, because unironically, he's probably a top 3 welterweight of all time off of his regional work alone. Condit does fit in this conversation. He lost more than his contemporaries besides Robbie Lawler, but he did legitimately fight everywhere, and when you fight everywhere against everyone all the time, yeah, you're gonna catch some losses. Who doesn't have a heel hook loss to Satoru Kirioka in 2005? That was just some shit you did. You know who else is cool for this, actually, is Paul Daly. You don't think of Paul Daly as active since 2003, but he was around the scene as well, losing to Pat Healy and Kirioka. He goes on this long winning streak in England, goes to Elite XC, gets some shine, and then his streak gets ended by who else but Jake Shields. That stupid piece of shit was everywhere. You got Nick Thompson being a regional hero, whose big long win streak gets ended by Jake Shields. Sean Scherk goes 19-0 with 2 Caro Parisian wins before he fights Matt Hughes in the UFC. Eddie Alvarez starts his career at 170 before he goes to Japan. Other divisions don't have this list, by the way. This isn't something that every division just claims to have. These are legitimately notable regional fighters whose reputation and perception was molded by their time on these circuits just as much, if not more so, than their time in big shows. All of this is to say that Carlos Condit has the credibility of an indie wrestler who made it big. But he is pretty undeniably not the best indie guy of his generation. He didn't have more success than his regional contemporaries, he's not more exciting, he didn't get the biggest wins. His likability and stylistic appeal does largely come from a foundation that he built in his WEC tenure, but even as a regional hero at welterweight, he still lacks that body to really get him over the finish line because, like his career in totality as a welterweight, he is in the hardest field possible for him to succeed in. If he had his exact same career, but he was a middleweight, forget about it. He probably goes 50-50 with Matt Lindland and has a classic with Robbie Lawler in 2006 before he also gets beaten by Jake Shields because that dumb fucker was snatching chains in 2 weight classes. You couldn't hide from Jake Shields in the 2000s, dude. It's serious. For my wrestling fan friends out there, Carlos Condit's best contemporary is Seth Rollins. Rollins is very good, but he is promoted to a status that he doesn't necessarily deserve because while he checks all the boxes of success in a major company, success on the indies, a unique style and appeal that hooked people in at a key time, he just isn't that guy. And the more that you insist that he is that guy, the more pushback he should receive. Condit is more beloved than Rollins, but it's really just because the era that he was so antithetical to was so much more maligned that people could memory hole themselves into believing that he was different than he was. And he comes with just enough regional credibility to back that up. With all of that said, there is something to this Rollins comparison that does hit on something about Condit that has always stuck with me. If you're more into MMA than wrestling, Seth Rollins' reputation among wrestling fans suffers from overprojection from his supporters. but also suffers from Rollins being a line-following corporate suck-up who is willing to pick up the shield and defend the Fed from criticism. So when people talk about his Ring of Honor success as a way to try to sell him as an indie darling, it rubs people in such a sensitive area that it creates such intense vitriol that is probably not warranted. This, in truth, is my case with Carlos Condit. Carlos Condit's lasting legacy, to me, is as a phony. He was a good fighter who fought against the grain and achieved more than he probably should have. And I've been able to reconcile how I feel about Condit and the good things that he's done. But there is no world where I ever view Carlos Condit as the real McCoy. And when people try to lend him regional credibility and talk about how much he gave and how ready he was to throw down whenever, all it does is make me hate him more. There are a few names that have come up a lot with Condit because of the era he fought. Names like Jake Shields, Robbie Lawler, but the one that needs to be explored is Nick Diaz. Because, truth be told, Carlos Condit and Nick Diaz are basically mirror images of one another. And while it can be easy to hear me say that Carlos Condit is a phony and hear me talk about Nick Diaz and conclude that I am a salty fanboy, I implore you, just hear me out. Because I do think that this is relevant. Condit and Diaz are fighters that have always existed in parallel. I think that it's fair to say that around 2010, there wasn't a single Condit fan who didn't love Nick Diaz and vice versa. Both of them were WBC welterweight champions. Both of them were fighting uphill against these shitter wrestlers who only wanted to wait out the clock. But where Condit went to the UFC to ply his craft and build his fan base, Nick Diaz was in Strikeforce. A world apart. Just two men who mirrored each other in nearly every way. Come late 2011, these worlds begin to collide as Nick Diaz made his way to the UFC, with Condit and Diaz being the top two spots at UFC 137. Nick Diaz faces Georges St. Pierre, and Carlos Condit faces BJ Penn. Speaking from a fan perspective, this was such an exciting time. If Condit beats Penn and Diaz beat GSP, then we could get a Carlos Condit versus Nick Diaz fight for the title. It was all people were excited about beyond GSP versus Diaz. These two star-crossed mirror images colliding in a guaranteed classic. Then, leading up to the fight, Diaz does some Diaz shit. He misses the beauty pageant, no-shows media obligations, and the UFC makes an example of him and removes him from the title fight, instead offering the fight to Carlos Condit, making GSP versus Condit a reality for UFC 137. Then, a few days later, they're able to get Diaz to still appear at the show, and they make BJ Penn versus Nick Diaz as the co-main. It's a really weird scenario, truth be told, but hey, Condit and Diaz are still in fights at UFC 137. We still get to see the Violence Boys do their shit. Then, I don't really know how to describe this without sounding insane, so I'll just sound insane. Some bullshit happens. Let me recount what has happened around UFC 137. Nick Diaz is coming in to fight GSP. Major fight, champion versus champion, big deal. Condit is on a 4-fight win streak in the UFC, but is clearly considered one fight away. Hence why he is facing BJ Penn in the co-main event and not against GSP for the title in the main event. Nick Diaz is removed from the main event and Condit is promoted, essentially gifted a spot by the UFC because of Nick Diaz's chicanery. But Diaz is able to remain on the card. GSP then pulls out due to injury a few weeks before the show, and Carlos Condit says that he is going to wait for GSP, making BJ Penn versus Nick Diaz the main event of UFC 137. This decision from Carlos Condit has never sit right with me. Even as I sit here as an adult who recognizes that fighters should look out for themselves and do what's best for their careers because nobody else will, I think that this is cowardice from Condit. You were not supposed to be in a title fight. You were booked for, essentially, a number one contenders match, and because of politics, you were promoted to the main event. But when an injury happens, you hold on to your gifted title shot for dear life like you earned it. I don't know that Condit was offered a replacement and turned it down. I imagine the UFC allowed him to keep it because he answered the call to face GSP, and they really reward shit like that. But it's always made me look at Condit a little bit sideways. But whatever. This impression doesn't last long because when Nick Diaz fights at UFC 137, he blows BJ Penn's doors off and calls out GSP after the event, effectively reviving interest in GSP versus Diaz. That fight is once again scheduled for UFC 143 in February. GSP versus Diaz for the welterweight championship, and once again, Carlos Condit is there in a number one contenders bout, this time against Josh Koscheck. So, points to you if you said earlier that Condit was scheduled to face Koscheck. However, GSP once again pulls out because of an injury, leaving Nick Diaz alone at the top of the pay-per-view, and it was here that the bout of dreams would be made. Carlos Condit is once again promoted to the main event, facing Nick Diaz for the interim championship. I want to make this abundantly clear before I go forward. This story is not supposed to be horrifically damning of Carlos Condit. All he has done so far is answer the call to fight for a championship when circumstances allowed him to. But what makes this story so upsetting so far is the contrast. When Condit was gifted a title fight against GSP in 2011, when GSP couldn't make it, Condit said, "I'm going to wait for him." When Diaz earned his title fight against GSP in 2012 and GSP couldn't make it, Diaz said, "Run it." Diaz could have waited. He could have played the game, but he didn't. He invited the smoke and allowed for Condit versus Diaz to get made. This fight that had existed in dreams for ages was a reality for the interim championship. 5 rounds of the 2 most exciting welterweights of all time going to war. Where my objection comes from, and has always come from regarding how UFC 143 proceeded, is this. Carlos Condit explicitly does not belong here in this main event. He does not deserve to fight for the championship, as has been demonstrated by him being booked in contendership fights 2 times under Nick Diaz. He is explicitly 1 fight away. He is in this spot at UFC 143 for 2 reasons. The grace of Nick Diaz being willing to run it, and because of the explicit promise of excitement. Josh Koscheck was also on the card. He could have gotten the call to fight Diaz, but instead, they called Condit, specifically because of the inherent promise of excitement between the two that bridges the gap of Condit not belonging in this spot. At the risk of sounding even more like a nerd, there are some fights out there that are about more than just a result. Fighters themselves shouldn't care about these things because their only vision should be winning. But as fans, there are some fights that matter more than just who wins and who loses. I know people who resent Chuck Liddell to this day because when he fought Wanderlei Silva in 2008, he shot a takedown at the beginning of the 3rd round, effectively undermining the appeal of that fight for a better chance at victory. Conversely, I know a lot of people who gained respect for Israel Adesanya for how he approached his fight with Anderson Silva, not cynically looking to embarrass a legend on his climb to contendership, but approaching him with reverence and respect. Condit Diaz was a fight for an interim championship, but more than that, it was a dream fight that was dreamed about because of the implicit electricity around them. When these two fight, it's always fireworks. What if they fought each other? Nick Diaz fighting these kinds of fighters has always lived up to this bill. Takanori Gomi, Robbie Lawler, Scott Smith, Mariusz Zaromskis, Paul Daly. Nick Diaz has never shied away from the moment because his name is his name. But when Carlos Condit got his gift title fight off of the promise of locking horns with Nick Diaz, he did exactly what he should have done as a smart and responsible fighter. He moved away, threw leg kicks, minimized exchanges, and maximized his chances of victory. Condit shouldn't have to do anything differently. He doesn't owe people a lights-out display. But I also don't owe him admiration for doing what he did. It was in this moment that Condit showed who he really was. A leech and a parasite who profited from association with the real. And once the real showed up, he was just like every other good company man who wants to do the right thing. Carlos Condit as a regional hero and a soldier fighting against the grain of welterweight as a reputation is earned. But to me, Carlos Condit is nothing but a Chrysler 300 who looked a lot like a Phantom, until a Phantom pulled up. I could go and talk about Diaz 125, or about how Condit said he wouldn't rematch Diaz and was waiting for GSP, which ultimately didn't matter because Diaz failed a drug test. And sure, those things have always made me mad. But the decision could have gone Diaz's way, and I would still look at Condit with utter contempt, because it's not the result I hate. It's the intent. Carlos Condit is a fighter who is tailor-made to stick in people's memories well. For a time, his losses weren't decisive. His successes in the losses were tangible enough that you can remember the highs. His highlights are neat. His vibe is great. He checks all the boxes to be remembered positively when the passage of time dulls the cracks and crevices that existed as time went by normally. Objectively, Condit is someone whose reputation, while I think is overstated, is warranted. He isn't someone who could still contend today. He isn't an uncrowned champion. But he was an exciting fighter that was antithetical to the way that welterweights are supposed to gain success, who came from the trenches. On a personal note, from someone who was there, who considers all facets of a fighter and not just their vibe, Carlos Condit is a pale imitation of the heroes that came before him. I will never forgive him for how he handled the chance to challenge GSP, and it will forever stain his credibility as a true marauder who stole what he could and gave nothing back. I don't hate Carlos Condit, but I will never respect him the way that people demand he be respected, simply because he does not deserve it.